Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited about this topic called Serving Students in Poverty, a framework for understanding the mindset often resulting from generational poverty. This is one of the webinars that we at Smarter Services provide to our clients. So, for our clients, especially those of SmarterMeasure, since it's directly related to that product, we're glad you're here. Thank you for coming today. But as we promoted this webinar to our clients, there was general broad interest. And so we opened up the registrations to many schools that are not our clients. And so we're especially glad that you're here today. We had tremendous interest in this topic. There were 482 persons registered for the webinar. So we're really excited about that. I think it is a conversation worth having, and I trust that it will be time well spent for you this afternoon. As others are still logging in, let's go over a few housekeeping items. We will share the webinar recording, the slide deck, and all of the resources that we mentioned during the webinar. You'll receive an email immediately after the webinar asking you to complete a survey. Please do that. And then a couple of days after the webinar, we'll send out another email that contains the recording and the slide deck and all of the free resources. Since we're expecting several hundreds of people to be here for this webinar, we don't have a chat because that can be confusing, but we do have the Q&A feature turned on. And so as you're listening to this content, if you have a question or a comment, please post it there in the Q&A feature. Our staff here at Smarter Services are monitoring that. And then at the end of the presentation today, Michael and I will address the questions and the comments that you have provided. Some of you have asked if you can get a certificate documenting your participation in this 1 hour webinar. We'll be glad to give you that. So just send an email to certificates@smarterservices.com, and we'll be glad to provide that documentation to you. So I am Dr. Mac Adkins, the founder and chief academic officer here for Smarter Services. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Michael Coleman, who's the chief executive officer of the Heart of Alabama Food Bank. I'll say more about Michael in just a moment, but it is serendipitous that this webinar is being shared on the International Day of Education as established by the United Nations. I'd love to tell you that we're smart enough and insightful enough to have planned that, but we did not. We recognized that recently, but I think it is in keeping with what the United Nations says there, that education is a human right, a public good, and a public responsibility. So thank you as an educator for being here today to talk about this important topic of how that we as educators have a responsibility for providing a public good that is a human right, and that's education. You know, organizations have why statements. We here at Smarter Services have one of the phrases in our why statement is that education makes life better. And that really comes from the research you're probably familiar with from the Gates Foundations many years ago that said that one of the best ways to break the cycle of generational poverty is through higher education. And so we've believed that for many years. It's one of the reasons why we come to work every day. So recently, I heard Michael Coleman share this information at another organization, a nonprofit organization that seeks to improve the human experience. And when I heard what he shared, I said, we have got to share this with our SmarterMeasure clients because the constructs that he will be talking about so closely map to the variables that we measure with SmarterMeasure. And so when you have that data and you understand this knowledge, then the conversations that you have with your students can be deeply, deeply enriched. And so that's what we're going to be sharing with you today. A little bit more about Michael before he gets started. We could pause after that first bullet and be done. He was in the Army. He retired from the Army after 21 years of service. He retired as a communications officer. So, Michael, thank you for your service to our country. But he is not one of those persons that just took up golf or fishing. But he says, now that I'm retired from the Army, I want to do something for the betterment of mankind. And he started out by founding a service here in Montgomery, Alabama called Hope Inspired Ministries. He led that for 7 years. They really provided education and other services to individuals and their families who are underserved in the Montgomery area. From there, he went up to Birmingham, Alabama, where he was the executive director of the Jimmy Hell Mission. The Jimmy Hell Mission meets the physical, mental, relational, vocational, and spiritual needs of persons who lack basic needs. And so he did a super job up there. In fact, so well that the Heart of Alabama Food Bank here in Montgomery invited him to serve as their chief executive officer. Their mission statement is to source, acquire, and distribute nutritious food to those who are experiencing hunger and food insecurity. Through their 200 plus partner agencies, they distributed over 27 million pounds of food last year. I can't even wrap my mind around 27 million pounds of food, but that's what they did there at the Heart of Alabama Food Bank. I've got to tell you, I know Michael Coleman personally. You'll hear this in the information he's about to share, but he is truly passionate about serving persons who are in need. And the stories he's about to share with you come from his experiences, and they really just highlight the truth that he'll be sharing, that we as educators want to help all persons, regardless of their socioeconomic status. But for some persons who are underserved, we especially want to help them. And so, understanding the mindset that may have evolved from living in generational poverty over several years, as you'll see in what he shares, when you understand this mindset, it will it will improve the conversations that you have with these students. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to Michael as he shares this framework with you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mac, and I'm really excited to be here and to share this information. I want to tell you before I actually get into the data what led me to that. When I was transitioning into the nonprofit space, I was working as a director of benevolence for an urban nonprofit, and we had so many people coming to us. And one of the things that we kept hearing over and over again was, "We need jobs, we need jobs, we need employment." And I thought, well, I know lots of people who run businesses who are always looking for good employees. And I said, hey, let's just get those two to meet. But there was a complete disconnect, seemingly between what the businesses were looking for and what the general population. In other words, we have people that said they need jobs, desperate for jobs. We have people who said I need to hire good people. You think, oh, that's a perfect fit. But it was a complete disconnect. And I thought to myself, there's got to be an understanding. Why is it that there's so difficult, so many barriers for people overcoming poverty? I mean, they have a desire to work, they have a desire to commit themselves to make their families more financially stable. But for whatever reason, it just became a real mystery to me. And I said, oh, if I could just uncover that, I could really help some people. And so I really just sought to learn. And what I found out was a lot of the information that I need was already researched and provided by Dr. Ruby Payne. And I know that Dr. Ruby Payne doesn't answer every question or deal with every problem out there, but let me tell you what this information did for me. I grew up in a middle-class environment. And so I was taught middle-class rules. And what you're going to find in this chart that I'm going to show you are 10 of the 15 that she puts in the book, and she calls them hidden rules of class systems. And what that means is, like for me, I was raised in middle class, and I was taught certain values and certain norms by my parents. And then when I went to school, those were reinforced by my teachers. And it's like you just know how to act, you know what social circumstances, what to do, how to proper handle, just all these things. And so when I transitioned into the military, a lot of the expectations, it was very easy for me to transition because a lot of the values were middle class values. It was something that I could easily adapt into as I was transitioning into that environment. There's nowhere, if somebody says, I want to learn middle class values, there's not a book. That's why the chart is called a hidden rules, because they're rules that you learn. You just know what you know. And if you know the rules to the middle class, you can go throughout the United States, certainly, and navigate any environment because you know what those hidden rules are. And it's very empowering, but it's equally disabling, if you will, if you don't know those rules. And this is what was so eye-opening to me. With people who are brought up in poverty. Now, I'm not talking about middle-class people who experience situational poverty, because you can experience situational poverty and struggle financially for months or even years. But if you know the rules to the middle class, that's a game changer. And the reason is because the work environment, wherever you go, are going to expect middle-class understanding of societal norms. Now, you'll notice in this chart that you have poverty, middle class, and wealth class. And we're not going to talk a lot about the wealth class, but just so you understand, the wealth class is not just talking about the person with the most amount of money. It's talking about people with homes in other countries, people who have butlers who answer the door, that kind of wealth. And so that's probably not many of us, certainly not anything I can identify with. But what Ruby, through her research, identified, and she said, listen, each class system, and here she just broke it out to three: poverty class, middle class, and wealth class, each have its own set of rules. And the rules from one class system do not transition to another class system. So imagine, if you will, if you're brought up in poverty and you learn a whole different set of rules, just like I learned the middle class rules, and then you went into an environment where you were going to have to earn your living and transition, except guess what? They don't understand your rules. They're expecting, they understand middle class, except you now don't understand it. So it begins to account for why is there such a disconnect. So me, from the middle class, and how I view it through the nonprofit space, and I've coached a lot of teachers in the community college system, spoken to even some universities about why this is so important, because individual students will come to their educators and they present problems. And it was very much the same way when I'm trying to help people in poverty. A lot of the things they did and a lot of things that they said simply didn't make sense to me. And I'm like, why are you making the decisions that you do? Why are you choosing to do what you do? And this whole subject took me back because I realized that the flaw started with me, the flaw to understanding, because what I was doing was I was expecting them to have the same societal norms and rules and understanding that I had. So when they began to communicate to me about how they lived their life and what they did in their community, it didn't make any sense to me. And it goes exactly what Ruby Payne says, which is the one set of rules does not translate into another set of rules. What it does is it creates all sorts of barriers. So I'm going to illustrate that as we walk. I'm going to walk through 10 of these. And I just want to emphasize this as well. What we're talking about here are class systems. Why is that important? Because when you talk about poverty class, just like middle class, I'm not talking about black poverty, white poverty, and Hispanic poverty. And that's important to understand because these rules apply regardless of race. Um, there are specific things and cultural things in black poverty, white poverty, and Hispanic poverty, but ultimately they manifest, while they may manifest themselves a little differently, they still seem to follow this same type rule system, regardless of race. Now, I also want to emphasize, I'm not discounting the challenges that people of color face outside of white. So yes, I want to acknowledge those up front. That's not what this is overcoming. And what I have found is in dealing with people of all races, some of the same challenges that oftentimes we just simply attribute to race are not based in race. They're based in what I consider to be thinking that is not healthy or sometimes just doesn't make sense, especially compared to the middle class system. And I'm going to try to illustrate that as we walk through. Understand, though, when I'm walking through this, I approach this subject with such humility because, like I said, the lack of understanding, it was an arrogance on my side. And what this led me ultimately to do is, wait a minute, if I care about people who are struggling in poverty and I want to help them, then it's incumbent upon me to move in their direction rather than just sit back and say, y'all need to come to me and you need to learn the rules. What I did when I started Hope Inspired Ministries was it was an environment for people who were kind of trapped in poverty to come. And then I would go and try to see the world through their eyes, try to see what barriers they were facing, and then help them navigate their way out because I could bring solutions and problem solving skills that could benefit them. It wasn't just giving them resources. I didn't have tons of resources to give, but it was relationally coming alongside of them without judgment as to how they ended up in poverty and said, if you want a better life, let's begin to walk this out and we'll unpack life day by day. And my commitment to you is that when you hit one of those barriers to poverty, I'm going to be there to help you overcome that. I'm not going to carry you through this process. You have to walk, but I'm going to walk alongside of you in relationship without judgment, understanding that I've been exposed to some things that you have not, and I want to help educate you and empower you so that you can take control of your life and you can do the things that will benefit you long term. So when she did the research, so let's take the subject of food. In poverty, the rule is, did you have enough? Because in poverty, the issue is, oh, I'm sorry, that's a typo, forgive me. I'm sorry. That says quality is important. It's not, it's quantity. So the key question in poverty is, did you have enough? Because it's about quantity. In middle class, oftentimes the question is, did you like it? Because it's about the quality of the food. Because let's face it, I just talked to a group of 70 college kids last night, and I said, most of y'all grew up in an environment, when you went home, you didn't ask the question, are we going to get to eat tonight? You just, without question, hey, what are we having tonight? Because you just assumed that there was going to be food and there was going to be enough food. That's a middle class value, and that's a middle class norm. But in poverty, they don't take for granted that there's always going to be food and there's always going to be enough food. Oftentimes, there's a certain amount of food, and it requires some sacrifice around those around the table. So poverty, quantity is the issue in the middle class. Quality, and of course, wealth. It's all about presentation. That's why I don't go spend a lot of money in fancy French restaurants because it looks pretty, but I never get enough to eat. So let's look at the issue with clothing. So clothing, and I'm skip over to middle class, is valued for its quality and acceptance into the norm. Label is important. So when we go out and shop, we're looking for quality. And if middle class, I get, sometimes if you don't have a lot of money, you still want to know, hey, this brand, I'm going to get a good quality shirt that's going to last me for X amount of time. That's important. But in poverty, It's about expression of individual style and personality. It's the appearance. One of the things that you will hear a lot in poverty is, even in the most extreme situations, you will have people that have a pair of shoes that have that color. The shoes will match the hat that matches the shirt, and there's all sorts of and you're like, I don't have that many shoes. I had a guy that came into my class, and I began to notice that, because when I started Hope Inspired Ministries, I had so much left to learn, and still do. But so I would spend a lot of time with the students just trying to say, well, this is what I'm reading, but tell me about your experience. And he had to, if his hat would always, he had a pair of Air Jordans to match the color of his hat and to match the color. I mean, he was decked out every time. It wasn't necessarily about the brand, but it was about the style, about matching, because that was an expression of being, hey, I'm put together. And the appearance was so important that when I'm going to present myself, I always want to present myself this way. I remember I was mentoring somebody, the son of a woman that I befriended, and she had spent years in addiction and had come out of that. But and as happens oftentimes when you're in addiction, and particularly you're a woman, you're surviving, you're trying to feed your kids. Again, I say this with no judgment, but she ended up prostituting. So I knew she was coming out of that, but I knew she didn't have a lot. So I was like, she had a 16-year-old son. And I said, what can I do to help? And she said, here, can you take him to the mall to get him a new pair of tennis shoes? And I said, hey, I'd be glad to. I'll take him out to eat and we'll get him a new pair of shoes. Well, he got in the car when I went to go pick him up. He already had a nicer pair of shoes on than I had. And it was a pair of tennis shoes. And I said, I looked down at the floorboard and I was like, we're going to get you a new pair of shoes. What's wrong with those shoes? But again, that's me speaking out of because my middle class value said, you have a good pair of tennis shoes. Why would you go get another one? But she felt guilty, and we can all understand this, that she was not the mother for many years she needed to. So she didn't have, I think she gave him $200. She didn't have $200 to get him another pair of shoes, nor did he really need another pair of shoes. But to them, they were following the value system and the rules set in poverty. Now, I'm going to stop right here and emphasize a point. One of the things that's so important, and hopefully by this, we can begin to reduce judgment in people. Because if a lot of people in the middle class saw that, they'd say, well, that's that woman. She's throwing away money. And she shouldn't come to me for help. If she's only got a little bit of money and she's going to waste $200 on a pair of shoes that her son doesn't need, that's wasteful. It's irresponsible. She shouldn't expect to come and get help from me. So we would say that in the middle class because we don't understand that she's not acting irresponsibly. She's acting in accordance with the rules of her class system. So I'll tell you this real quick, and I've got 30 minutes to present all this, so I don't want to get bogged down. But to illustrate this, my father struggled with this concept. He's no longer here, but he struggled with this concept. And I tried to help him understand that people who are different, people in poverty who do things are no different than he is. And one time he challenged me and I said, okay, explain it to me. And one of the things that was bothering him, he actually had a State Farm agency in Selma, and he had kids who would come by with saggy pants. And he thought, well, that's just outrageous, because that value was in conflict with his value system. And so he would leave with all sorts of judgment and say all sorts of things. And I said, Dad, I'm going to show you you're no different than that kid walking with the baggy pants. And so we got in this conversation. I said, you grew up in a little community called Fort Deposit. I said, now, you all could climb over into an automobile and take apart an Oldsmobile with a 9/16-inch wrench. You all fed chickens and milked cows before you went to school. You all chased the same girls. You wore the same clothes. You wore your hair the same. You all drag raced up and down the road and drove other parents crazy. I said, now, what you were doing was, forget whether it was responsible or not, what you were doing was is you were following the rules of your community. Because we as human beings are always going to seek out community. And in the middle class, he was with other middle class, although lower middle class, but still middle class teens who were doing the very same things. I said, now, imagine how odd it would be if all of a sudden you weren't dressing like this group. You all of a sudden stood out and were totally different and wore your hair differently and talked to different people. I said, you would stand out, but you didn't do that. You gravitated right into your group. I said, now, this kid that you're seeing, you have to understand that when he's back in his environment, that's how the people in his community dress. So he's doing the same thing you are. It's human nature to follow the rules of the community that you are a part of. I said, what you're seeing is him step outside of his community, walking down the street, and you're judging him by your standards and not the standards of his community. And so it looks odd. And I said, so when we do that, and look, let's just face it, we tend to do that with a lot of things. When people are different, they act different, they speak differently, they have a different value system. If it doesn't fit right in with us, we declare things like this is wrong, or you shouldn't do this, or it should be this way, rather than trying to understand what we're really watching. And so the whole point of this brief is to maybe shift your lens just a little bit, so that if you're dealing with somebody in poverty, we can have a little bit greater understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, even though it may be frustrating, even though it may not make any sense. I want you to have a little bit better understanding, because if you understand that what they're doing is not, it's irresponsible or can be irresponsible when matched up against middle class rules and expectations, what they're not doing it with the intention of being irresponsible. They're living by the very rules of which they've been taught their entire life, which is a very human thing to do. So let's go on to the money. These next two things are very key. One is money and one is time. Okay, so in middle class, I learned that money is something to be managed. And I always remember my mother sitting down back in the day, had a stack of checks, and she would tell me, Michael, we have to pay all our bills first. And if there's any money left over, maybe we get to go out to eat once in the next 2 weeks. But if we don't, hey, we're just going to be, we're just going to survive until the next, but we have to pay our bills first. And then we'll set aside the rest of this. And that was managing money. Well, in poverty, when you get money, you think of money's to be used, money's to be spent. There's no thought in poverty because there's rarely any excess. So you don't manage money. So lots of times you can give somebody $400 to help them with an electric bill, or you could give them $4,000. And because the rules of poverty don't teach you how to manage money, that's not an expectation in that culture, then what begins to happen is they're going to be right back in need, because regardless of the amount of money, they don't know how to navigate the world with them. But part of middle class rules are, we're taught at a young age, in most cases, now there's always exceptions, but we're taught, hey, you don't get your paycheck and just go buy the fun thing you got to do. You've got a mortgage coming up. You've got rent and utilities and everything else due. Now, combine that with time. The only thing that matters regarding time is the present. Decisions made for the moment, and they're based not necessarily on logic, but on feelings. But let's just focus on time being the present. Why is that true in poverty? It's because when you're in poverty, your main goal is to survive. And so you may have 100 fires ahead of you, and you just take them one fire at a time. And so lots of times when I would have people come to me and say, Michael, can you help me pay my utility bill? They're going to turn off my power. And I would say, well, when are they going to turn it off? Well, they're going to turn it off this afternoon. And I'm like, oh, come on now. You got this notice 2 weeks ago in the mail. Why are you just now bringing it up? And that would be very frustrating to me. And I would even declare that that's irresponsible. You waited to the last minute. But again, that's me not understanding, because you could go back 10 days and every meal they got to figure out how they're going to eat. Every situation they got to figure out how they got to navigate. There's no thinking into the future like middle class. Think about this for a second with education. Every one of you that wanted to be an educator had to end up going to college. And when you went to college and you enrolled in college and you went through all the application process, you were not getting more money at the time. Matter of fact, it was costing you, parents, whoever, more money. But you were doing something in the now because you were thinking towards the future. Everything we do in middle class is like, if I do this today, here's going to be the future results. Now, let me tell you something else that I don't think is mentioned in the book, but it's certainly, I think it's worth mentioning. When I think about my actions, if I think about let's say I'm very angry at work, or I'm very angry at my teacher, and I'm just going to express that. I don't think about consequences if I'm in poverty. In the future, I'm like, well, I really want to go tell my boss off, but I've got a house payment coming up and I can't afford to get fired. So I'm thinking into the future. I'm not going to act today. I'm going to restrain myself, and I'm not going to act in the future because I don't want to have to suffer the consequences. But in poverty, when you're only thinking in the moment and those decisions are based on feelings or survival, if somebody in generational poverty is threatened or feels threatened, they will lash out. They will curse out a boss. If they feel like they're being done unfair, they will voice it. They will act out in a disruptive way because that's how they're feeling inside. But there's never been any thought of consequences because people in generational poverty are not taught to think in the future. They can't afford to think in the future. They only think in the moment. And so I use this illustration just to try to help people navigate that and to understand. I said, just imagine if you closed your eyes and you opened them up and you were in downtown Paris, France, except you don't speak French. You don't have any money and you can't communicate to people around you. And you would then be, how do I navigate the space? What I do? Well, the first thing that's going to come to mind is I don't even know where my next meal is going to come from. And so let's say you found a shelter and you're like, okay, I can get a meal. Okay, and then the next thing is it just gets back to basics. Where am I going to lay my head tonight? And then you lay your head there and you get up the next morning. Guess what? That whole cycle would start over again. Now, thankfully, we don't have to navigate life like that, but it's a whole class of people that is their life. And so when that's their view, they're just surviving. A lot of the middle class norms and expectations don't fit into that space. And so you don't always understand that. It may manifest itself as looking like I'm resisting or I hate authority or I'm lazy, whatever it is, when in reality, the issues go much deeper and have nothing to do with those things. So I'm gonna pick up the pace just a little bit. Education. Education is valued and revered. People in poverty understand it, but it's abstract because most of the people in their world, while they value education, they don't see it as a realistic thing, primarily because their parents don't have any education. Many would never graduated from high school, don't have a GED. So they know that it's a good thing, but they see no pathway to them transitioning into a situation where they could get a degree. Again, thinking into the future, hey, if I go to college, I get a degree. This is future thinking. I'm going to tough it out for 4 years, and then I'm going to be able to work myself out of poverty. Just left alone, that's a very difficult thing for somebody to imagine. In the middle class, we understand that if we want to move forward in life, it doesn't necessarily have to be college. It could be training, it could be certifications, it could be all sorts of different stuff. But I have to develop more skills, and that's going to come through some type of education. And so our parents, I mean, both my girls are, my daughter, youngest daughter's got her PhD, my other daughter is getting her EDS. I always emphasize the importance of education. But it was something that was ingrained in them. I never said, well, if you go to college, I always said when you go to college. So it was always an expectation built in. That's not an expectation. That's not even something that enters the mind on a daily basis of somebody in poverty. So it's a real struggle to see that. Family structure. This should not be a surprise to anybody. The poverty class tends to be matriarchal. You don't have the family structure and the family dynamic that you tend to do in the middle class. It tends to be more patriarchal. And I could sit here and do an hour just on that one difference between homes that are led by matriarchs and those that are led by patriarchs. Now, let me totally in the dark. So let me give you a true scenario. Talking to a business owner, they said they gave a kid a job who was in poverty. He stayed there 3 days. He left. I said, "What is your conclusion by that?" He's lazy and doesn't want to work. See, there's the judgment. He looks at that as mine went to the negative. And I said, let me give you all the other things it could be. Imagine again, you're coming into an environment where you really aren't living by the same norms. You don't even agree on what humor is and your value system and all those kind of things are just totally different. It's tough to come into that every single day and navigate that space. It's not a barrier to us because those things agree with what we've done our whole life. It's easy for us. But somebody coming out of poverty, that's a huge barrier for them to gain understanding about maybe what people in the middle class may find funny. Destiny, believes in fate, can't do much. This to me is heartbreaking when I read this because we understand for the most part in the middle class, hey, if I'm making some bad choices, if I'm always broke because I'm always blowing my money, you know what? I'm gonna begin to do some things differently. I'm gonna set up a savings plan. I'm gonna go get some education. I'm gonna change my circumstances because I have the power to do so. Think of how much more optimistic a middle class person would be because they're like, yeah, I'm doing some things, but look, the reality is it's my fault. I'm making some really bad choices. But imagine growing up in generational poverty and everything around you is a struggle. I mean, just on a daily basis. And then you're looking at like, but there's nothing I can do about it. This is my life and I'm always going to be there. That is such a hopeless situation. And it's based on, unfortunately, some reality because a lot of people who want to lift people out of poverty, look at what's going on in some of the things and form so much judgment and again, just add to the already significant amount of barriers that are there. Driving forces. What's important? We're driven by work and achievement. I know that lots of times I'll put in 60, 70 hours. That's what I value. I want to do a good job. It's important to me that my name is connected to not achievement necessarily, but if people say, Michael's a good worker, Michael's a hard worker, that's important to me because that was emphasized to me by my father. No matter what you do, you want to be good at it and you want to strive for it. At least the achievers in this world do. But in poverty, that same driving force is not there. It's about survival. This is all what you're doing and thinking about is all great. I'm just trying to get through the day. Much different. Okay. Last slide for me. Here's some academic behavior that can be influenced by because lots of times when we have students in the classroom, and Open Spire Ministries spent 6 weeks in the classroom every single day navigating classroom and teaching and coaching to these students, and we saw almost all of these things exhibited at some point or not. So little procedural memory used in poverty. Sequence is not used or valued. So you see difficulty following directions. So I'll use it this way to try to paint you a picture. Imagine if I told you, hey, I'm going to send you in here to the next room. I need you to go sweep the floor. Most of us would go to the corner and begin to sweep along the edge, and we'd sweep the whole floor. When somebody in generational poverty, it was the norm that they would take, might have to show them how to use the broom and the dustpan, but then they'd walk around until they saw something, and then they would sweep it up. But it was not a sense of, I start at one point and I work all the way through it, step 1, step 2, step 3. That's not part of because living in poverty and survival is not organized, it's disorganized, it's chaotic. So you don't have that sequential type thinking. It's not used or it's valued, so it's not taught and emphasized in the rules of poverty. So if you're a teacher and we need to be mindful of that when you say, look, I gave you a 10-step process, or I gave you in your, I'm drawing a blank on the what you give them at the beginning, syllabus. I told you 1, 2, 3, what's going to be required of you, but you had to do it in this order. Just understand, while it seems very simple to us and very laid out, it can be difficult for somebody else who's never had to follow a sequence. Consistently disorganized, there's no planning, there's no scheduling, there's no prioritizing skills. It's not for a lack of desire. Those things are simply not taught in poverty. And most of the time, it's because you don't have the space available. Now, that does not mean I'm saying that people in poverty or don't take care of themselves or don't take care of their homes or anything. That's not what I'm saying. One good example is I had a student who came to me one time because I was fussing at him. I was so frustrated. I'm like, every paper that you do at night, you come back, it's all crumpled up. You can't ever find anything. Why are you so disorganized? And he told me that his uncle and he said, I used to have more room, but I have my uncle and his family staying in my bedroom. So not just in the house, he's now sleeping on the floor. He has to go outside to change his mind. He didn't have any space to do anything in his world, on top of the fact that he had never valued anything about planning or schedule. So you may have students that come in constantly losing stuff, constantly lack of planning, and you as a teacher, I understand, may just get frustrated with that and say, look, I'm just going to count off points or whatever. How you change people's life is if you understand that they're constantly disorganized, just maybe take 5 or 10 minutes. I'm not saying it's always going to work, but if you understand it, then you're allowed to have more empathy for that student rather than judgment. And you might sit down for 5 or 10 minutes and say, hey, have you thought about this? Let me give you some things that and you begin to coach them, understanding it's not a desire not to do it. It's that they don't have any sort of framework to understand how to do it. No procedural self-talk. They don't see the whole task. That kind of ties in a little bit. So if, with what I said earlier about not seeing something all the way through and how to do it, you might ask them to take this test and they might complete the first page and might not go on to do the rest. Disrespectful to teachers. You have to understand when you grow up in an environment where it's chaotic and everybody, even sometimes mothers, are working against you for their own benefit. I had a 19-year-old girl, beautiful young girl, who came to us in class and she said, I can't get my ID. And I said, why can't you you have to have an ID to go to work. I can't get it because my mother has my ID and she has my food stamps and she has my birth certificate. And she won't let that go because she controls my food stamps. And to let that go means she would give up that benefit. And there was absolutely nothing I could do about it other than I said, well, I talked to chief of police and he says they would have to arrest your mother and charge her with identity fraud. Well, a child in poverty is not going to have their mom arrested. So I was almost helpless to be able to help this young woman move into a different direction. But it was the fact that she didn't have any adults in her life. Even her own mother was working against her, was not helping her overcome barriers, but was actually creating a barrier. So just understand where you have higher rates of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, a lot of difficult situations. A child who acts out or seems frustrated, lots of times simply does not have the skill set to know how to navigate emotions. Inappropriate comments, I'll just say this. There's two key registers. I know there's more. There's a formal register and a casual register. When you go on a job interview, you're going to use the formal register. You're worried about how well you speak and your grammar, if you're speaking to a class the same way. But if you're sitting around on a Saturday watching a college football game, you don't care what your grammar sounds like. That's your casual register. In poverty, there is no formal register. You only know one register. So if you use profanity in the group of the way, you could be on a job interview and use profanity because that seems the norm, and they may use profanity or say something that's inappropriate or joke about something that's inappropriate in the classroom. But you have to understand they don't have this code switching mentality of, wait a minute, I'm in a more serious formal environment. I need to use a different language level. Laugh when disciplined. This happens more so with men, it seems like. That's just from my experience. And lots of times when a man is called, a young boy in poverty is called up, he has these emotions come up, he's embarrassed, so he laughs. And I've seen it a million times. Middle class teachers go, oh, you think that's funny? Oh, you don't care? You think this is frivolous? And the reality is he does care, but he's shamed or embarrassed and doesn't know how to present a way. He doesn't have the vocabulary, he or she doesn't have the vocabulary to say, what you said embarrassed me. Can we talk about it? That's not how you negotiate. And that's not how you navigate in poverty. Things typically are sorted out in a physical way and not with the use of words. Unwilling to ask for help. This is the last thing, and I'll just share this story with you to let you understand what a big deal this is. Because when you navigate space in middle class society, and I go into somewhere like a bus station, train station, if I've never been there, the very first thing I'm looking for is the help window. And I seek them out because I'll ask a stranger, ask anything. But in the world of poverty, where fitting in matters, if you ask a question, you are risking sounding dumb. And therefore, you become fodder for people ridiculing and making fun of you. And then that endangers you to being excluded from the group. And if you're excluded from the group, that's now you're outside of your community. And that's one of the most devastating things that can happen in poverty. So my last story, and I'll turn it back over to Mac, is we had several students doing this. We would give them a bus pass to be able to come to our training. And yet they were still depending on rides. And of course, as you know, rides are not always dependable. And so we were having to dismiss students, but we couldn't figure out why is it that you won't take advantage of we're giving you a free bus pass. So with further investigation and walking down there and going through that whole process, what we found out is many students were going down there to the bus station, but they would not go to the help window, even though it was right there when you open up the door. And they were trying to navigate, just figure out which one's my bus and which one's not. And when they couldn't figure it out, they gave up on it because they weren't going to ask the question. even to the point that we had some people begin to experience anxiety attacks. And so they just would quit the program. They'd never go back to the bus station. And we were interpreting that as, that's so dumb. We're giving you a ticket. The help desk is right there, because we didn't understand the rules of poverty. You don't ask for help navigating the world for risk of looking dumb. So let me summarize this whole thing. There's 5 more in the book to talk about. I just want you to understand that if you grew up in middle class, even if you're in the north, south, whatever, we can navigate anywhere in the world because we know these social norms. Those same things apply in each class system, and one class system does not translate into another class system. Mac, I said that was the last one. Can I have 2 more minutes?
2 more.
I'm sorry. I've probably gone over time. All right. Oh, wait a minute. I have 2 more. All right, 2 more. Ruby Payne told a story in person, and she said this. When there was, she had a friend on the Chicago Board of Trade. She was middle class, and the person was sick, and she took her a casserole, and the butler answered the door and was very confused. And so she said, I heard Mary was sick, and I brought her this casserole. She comes back in, and Mary's confused, and she's like, well, I guess it's put in the kitchen. A week later, she heard Mary's still sick, and she bakes her a cake and takes her the cake. Same situation. Finally, a third person intervened with Ruby and said, why are you trying to embarrass Mary? And she says, what do you mean? And she said, if Mary needs food, she'll send her servants to get food. Now, what that illustrates is everybody in middle class understands that what Ruby was trying to convey was, I'm concerned about you, and this food represents that concern. However, that was a middle class rule that she was trying to apply to somebody in a different class system, and it was totally misinterpreted and totally misunderstood to where she was accused of trying to shame that person. I hope this helped you. I'm always available for any questions, and I'll stay on as long as Mac allows me to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And I'm sure you guys, when I first heard this, the light bulbs really went off about how this explains so much of the experience that I've had in serving these students, because higher ed is so influenced by the unspoken norms of the middle class and all of our policies and our procedures and our deadlines and all of those things, that really being able to shift our lens and understanding how a person living from generational poverty thinks differently really helps. Now, many of you on the call, are our client, you use SmarterMeasure, you know what it is. Others of you may not. It is not an assessment that identifies persons living in poverty. You would get that data from like your financial aid department. But what SmarterMeasure does, as I'm going to show you in just a moment, is that it informs the conversations that you may be having with these students. So whether that's admissions counselors, academic advisors, FYE coordinators, orientation coaches, whoever is student facing, as they're having conversations with these learners experiencing these struggles, when they understand this mindset, it does shift their lens and it colors that conversation. Now, here on the left are variables that the SmarterMeasure Learning Readiness Indicator quantifies, right? So you've got a numerical score over these things: control over procrastination, availability of a place to study, willingness to ask for help. All of those things you've got a measurement of. So when you're talking with a student and they're low on those, and you may know from another source that they may be coming from poverty, that really shapes that conversation that you're having with them. I won't read this whole thing to you. We'll send this out, but just a couple. So if a person has a low score on control over procrastination, well, now this framework may have highlighted the fact that they're accustomed to living in survival mode, right? So putting something off until next week, that's not a problem. That's just surviving, right? So understanding that really helps. Or having an appropriate place to study. Well, in the middle class, that may mean having your own room and with a broadband connection, but many persons live in spaces that are occupied by many, many people, often without internet access. So as you can see there on the left, many of these things that we're quantifying with SmarterMeasure directly relate to the framework that Michael was just describing. So, what can schools do about it? Here are some different things. You can be aggressive with your advising. That is, reaching out and trying to proactively solve issues instead of waiting on students to come to you after they're failing. One such example would be helping students fill out that complicated FAFSA form. You may establish food pantries to help out with students that have food insecurities and needs. Some colleges have a program called Swipe Out Hunger, which takes the unused dollars that people like my daughter, who does not spend all of her meal plan, and gives those funds to students who need them. The California Assembly passed a bill that requires every community college in their state to provide safe parking lots for unhoused students who are sleeping in their cars. Maybe an idea for your institution. As we're hiring, look for persons from backgrounds that understand this framework and have training sessions. Maybe share this recording with your university officials and faculty members to help recognize this mindset. There's another book that I wanted to mention. It's mostly from the K 12 perspective, but what it's talking about really applies to higher ed. Eric Jensen is the author. Poor Students, Rich Teaching is the title. And really, the first bullet point there is what we're trying to do in this webinar is to understand the urgency of poverty in the US and how poverty affects education, engagement, and academic achievement. And hopefully, that's been enlightened by this information that we've shared today. There's just a little bit of information about what the Heart of Alabama Food Bank does, as well as us here at SmarterServices. I mentioned SmarterMeasure. We also provide Smarter Proctoring, which offers all 7 different modalities of proctoring: live and live online and automated, hybrid. If you're interested in any of that, let us know. So we're about officially out of time. Some of you may have to run, and we do respect your time because that is a middle class value, right? But Michael and I are going to hang on here. There may be some of you that have a question that you want addressed. We'll stay here until we get those answered. Our staff has been managing that. But if you need to drop, we are about at the top of the hour. We understand that. We will be sending out the recording to everyone. The Q&A has really been insightful. Many students are saying, wow, this is light bulbs are going off for me as I'm hearing this. So I'll pause now. And one of our staff, there may be a question and answer that stands out that you'd like to have addressed. So Julie or Carol, if you'll speak to that, that would be good.
Yeah, thanks, Mac. Great presentation, Michael and Mac. There has been so many great questions, comments, thoughts, people sharing even personal things that I answered them privately. And I cannot stress enough in a genuine way, not just myself, but our company. We so appreciate you being here. And yeah, this is a sensitive topic, right? It's a little touchy and it can be a little controversial. So we decided as a company that we were going to dive into it and go there because it's an important conversation. So most everything has been answered, Mac and Michael. On a side note that may or may not be applicable to the group, there's been a couple of ideas or thoughts in general around the topic of perhaps a follow-up webinar. I know we talked about that. So if you want to speak to maybe what that could look like, and I think we could look at their comments and questions and maybe form it from that. And then also, we need to acknowledge that some of the research that we talked about today is dated. We knew that going into it. There's been updated information since then that is very similar, but I would love to open that up. It's a little, touchy, but I want to bring that up because I think it would be great for a follow-up. And I do want to address some of those, questions about that as far as the research goes.
Yeah, we're certainly open to another webinar. As Michael said, there are 5 other elements of the paradigm that he did not speak to. Plus, I'd love to spend a little bit more time on coaching of how to use SmarterMeasure data to inform the conversation that you're having with learners who have this mindset. So, if you're here, you'll get another email from us about another webinar later in the year. Michael had already said that he would be open to doing that.
100%. Thank you. And there was also something that brought up that it said, okay, so we've talked about middle class and sort of somewhat of the wealth mindset, somewhat of the poverty mindset, but is there going to be another follow-up or ways that how then do we help those students in poverty? Not just, I think the first step we got to learn, right? We're learning what those mindsets are, but how do we help those students be successful? And I thought that was a really good thought.
Yeah, it is. And I'm just reading through just privately as we're talking, I'm reading through some of the questions and some of the comments, and I see a wide range of things. And that's exactly what this talk is designed to do, is to provoke thought and people to look within themselves and, It'll be of some great use to some, and some will be like, well, I don't know about it. Here's what, when I talk with, one of the questions is, well, how do you get this out to other people? Well, I go around for years. I've talked with people in churches and other things and tried to express, not just churches, but civic groups and otherwise, and try to help share some of these concepts and put it in a way that they can begin to understand that their approach oftentimes is filled with a lot of assumptions and a lot of things like, hey, I just need to preach at somebody, or I just need to tell them this. And really what this taught me was, first of all, how much I didn't understand about the very people I'm trying to help, that I profess to care about. And so it was very humbling for me, because I had to step back for a second and say, wait a minute, I want to help these people, yet I'm bringing to cures. In my mind, I'm bringing cures to this problem, and I don't even truly understand the problem. So I started with, hey, I'm going to move in their direction, not with answers necessarily, but just an idea of, hey, I care. I want to hear what's going on in your life. I want to understand, and then I want to help us together. How can I empower you? I don't want to do it for you, because, well, sometimes you have to, I get it, but you don't want that regular, because that creates dependency. That's not going to help them long term, because you're not going to always be there with somebody. But you love them and you say, hey, how do I empower you? So I'm going to coach you, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to be there for you. And that's why, when getting your hands dirty in the lives of somebody else, it requires that. It's not just like me taking 30 minutes to talk to y'all about this. I hope that helped. But to really get into the weeds, I'm going to have to invest in people's lives. And it takes time, it takes resources, it takes energy, it takes a commitment. And there's just no magic solutions, because even the framework I've given you, there's a million variables to each one of those that I don't have the time or even the understanding of how to speak to all of it.
A concept that I'd love to toss out and just have a focus group or a panel really pitch this around, because I realize it's controversial, but we in higher education, I think over the last 2 decades, have done a really good job, not only in our facilities, but also in our instruction, about making accommodations for learners with physical and emotional disabilities. Could that be extended to make accommodations for learners who are coming from generational poverty? Open for debate. I think it merits some consideration. Obviously, fraught with problems and issues. Who qualifies? What would be those accommodations that would be appropriate? But if we're really seeking to serve all students, to help persons break that cycle of poverty, I think it's an idea that's worthy of discussion. Lots of good questions and answers have came in. We'll be sharing those with Michael. You see our emails there on the screen. Either one of us will be open to you guys reaching out to us individually, but we'll be continuing this conversation as we go across the year. I'll probably do some blog posting on it, and we'll have another webinar. But thank you for your time today in thinking about this. I challenge you to continue thinking about it, have a dialogue with your colleagues, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your time today. You are at the right place for this webinar titled Continuing the Conversation about Serving Students in Poverty. This is the second session in this series, and today we'll focus on good practices in using data and resources to benefit students. As others are joining us, we'll go over some housekeeping rules, but before we do that, let me just comment that I am so excited about this topic, and I'm extremely pleased with the response that we've had to providing information on this topic. For the first session of this series, we had over 450 registered. For this one, we have over 200 registered for the second session. So this certainly is a topic that's of interest to many institutions and hopefully will benefit many of their students. Okay, so housekeeping, as a few others join us today, you will receive an email that goes out to all registrants that will include the webinar recording, the slide deck, and all of the resources that we mentioned during the webinar. Uh, During the webinar today, you are encouraged to post your questions or comments. We'll be using the Q&A feature of Zoom. That's so that our staff can monitor that. They'll be responding to your questions as they can as we progress. We will have time for a Q&A at the end, which we can open some of your mics if we need to, if you'd like to have a conversation about some of the items that we talk about during today's webinar. Some of you are interested in a certificate of participation for 1 hour of continuing education. We're pleased to offer that. Just send an email to certificates@SmarterServices.com, and we'll be glad to get that certificate out to you. In the email that you receive after the webinar, there will be a link to a survey. It's just a satisfaction survey to let us know what you thought about this one and to give us some ideas for upcoming webinars as well. So for our current clients, we're glad you're here. We consider you family. It's good to be with you again. For those of you who are here today that are not our current clients, we're really glad that you're here today. These webinars are just something that we provide free to our clients as really a value-added benefit where we talk about issues and concerns to higher education institutions. What we're going to be doing today is, first of all, reviewing the framework that is the mindset that often emerges from living in poverty. We're not going to spend as much time on that as we did in the first session, but in case there are those who were not in the first session, we will give it a cursory review. Most of our time today will be spent exploring some good practices about serving students who have difficulties in meeting their basic needs. Most of the content we'll look at today are examples of good practice from Amarillo College. As I did a lit review about schools that do a great job with this, I kept seeing the name of Amarillo College. I did reach out to a couple of people there. They really regretted that they did not have a resource person who could be here with us live today, but they did share with us a video that you'll be seeing that's just great. And some of the people in the video, as well as a person you see on the slide deck, are no longer with Amarillo College. They've moved on to other institutions where they're still working in this role of serving students and meeting their basic needs. But since that center there is short-staffed, they didn't have anyone who could join us live today, but they certainly give us their full support, and they've provided lots of information that you're going to consider very practical today. And then after we look at that information from Amarillo College, I'm going to talk with you about how you can use non-cognitive factors. That's the data we collect with SmarterMeasure, how you can use that data to inform the conversations that you have with students who are living in poverty or who have insecurities regarding their basic needs. So what is this poverty framework that we're talking about? Well, first of all, you understand that no person is an island, right? We're all shaped, influenced by the communities that are around us. So whether you think of this framework, whatever label you put on it as a mental model, a worldview, a schema, a frame of reference, unconscious bias, whatever label you put on it, the norms, the rules of the cultures that we spend our time in influence us, perhaps in even ways that we're not really aware of. And one of the main ways they influence us is through our social economic strata. Well, the framework identifies different patterns of thinking that emerges after a person has spent considerable time in any of the three different socioeconomic strata. Now, let me issue a caveat, right? What we're about to talk about in this model, these are generalizations that most of the time ring true to some degree. But obviously, there are exceptions to persons at all three of these levels. There are people that live in the middle class that don't think and act like the norms of the middle class. There are people that live in wealth that don't act and think like that. There are persons who live in poverty that don't act and think like the norms typically spin. So certainly there are exceptions. So what we're talking about here are generalizations. So this is the framework. It comes from the work of Ruby Payne. She's referenced there at the bottom. She's published several books and articles about this. You can Google it, find lots of information about this. Certainly recommend further investigation of her resources to you. So the actual framework has about 15 different items that you see there on the left. For sake of brevity today, we're not going to talk about all 15. I'm just going to kind of review 6 of these kind of quickly, just so that to refresh your memory about what we talked about. So the way that the framework is displayed here is that you've got 3 different socioeconomic groups, right? Most of the people on this call, I'm assuming, operate from the middle class, right? A lot of us work at institutions of higher education. We've got good jobs. We're not wealthy. We probably have a budget and we're watching the money. I get paid once a month, and I know that toward the end of the month, it's getting tight, right? That's middle class, right? Most of us can relate to that. Um, Probably, and there I may be surprised, there may be a person or two on this webinar that live in the wealth class. And by this, I mean people who are really, really wealthy, multimillionaires. And most of the time, for all of these quadrants, you really are most impacted by the thinking if you've been in this socioeconomic strata for multiple generations. So we're talking about generational wealth here. And persons who, if they're third generation really wealthy, well, they're really going to think like a really wealthy person. Same thing is true for poverty. If you're multi-generational poverty, you're going to think like that. Now, if you win the lottery, you may move immediately from poverty to middle class financially. But guess what? The norms and the patterns of thinking that people who have been wealthy for multiple generations, you're not going to have those, right? And that's very important. And we get that if you win the lottery, you're not immediately going to think like a person that's been wealthy for multiple generations. So that's going to be important in a moment as we're talking about serving persons living in poverty. So let's look at a few of these examples just to kind of understand what this framework is about. The first example is very visual. It's almost kind of humorous when you think about it, but it really helps us to see the differences in the way different people in different socioeconomic stratas think about things. So first of all, look at food. We're going to start with the middle class on each of these because for most of us, that's where we live. That's what we can relate to, right? Well, middle class, what's it like when we go out to eat? Well, we may go out to eat, and if I ask my wife, was that a good meal? What am I talking about? Well, I say, well, was it good? Was the quality of that meal good? That's how I judge its value. Now, if there's some point that we really splurge and we go to a nice restaurant, not too often, but if we were to do that, when we go there, the food's different in a really nice restaurant, right? The presentation of that food is what's important. I'm not a person that takes a lot of pictures of my food and posts it on Facebook. But if I went to a really nice restaurant and the presentation of that food was really beautiful, well, that might be one I take a picture of, right? Because the way I would judge that is by presentation of the food. Well, persons living in poverty, if you ask them what's a good meal, it's going to be one which the quantity is important. So think about those buffets, right? Those low cost buffets you go to where you can just eat and eat and eat, right? It's all about quantity. So that's just kind of a visual image that you can get to kind of see the differences in the way food is experienced differently in the different classes. Now, let's think about something a little bit more important than food. Driving forces. These are the factors that motivate us. And again, starting with the middle class, achievement and work. That's the framework we're coming from. That's what motivates us. And I'm eat up with this, people. I recently took the Strength Finders assessment, and my number one strength was achievement, right? And I enjoy work. That's just the way I'm made. I've raised up in multi-generational middle class. I value getting things done. I really enjoy working. Why? Well, part of it is that influence I've had over multiple generations in being in the middle class. Well, persons in wealth, guess what? They don't have to clock in at 8 o'clock. They're not going to work. They're already multimillionaires. They were born into this wealth, likely. So, what's important to them is not achievement, but what's important to someone in the wealth class are connections. It's how connected they are financially, politically, and socially. So think about, those wealthy families you see on the news, the movie stars, the whatever. It's who they know that's important, right? It's the connections. Now, for persons living in poverty, what's their driving force? It's not achievement, it's not connections, it's survival. When you don't have your basic needs met, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, that's what you're thinking about, right? It's that pyramid of basic needs. And our basic needs at the bottom of that pyramid is going to be the main thing we're thinking about if those needs are not securely met. So survival, relationships, especially with their immediate family, and entertainment, those are the driving forces for persons living in multi-generational poverty. So we can understand those differences. So now let's think about time, the way persons approach time. Well, for persons in the middle class, future is very important, right? The decisions that we make today, I'm trying to teach my daughter, in fact, that's her calling right there, trying to teach my daughter to plan ahead. She's in college, and I want her to do well in college because the decisions she makes today really affect her tomorrow, right? So it's the future that's important. Well, in the wealth class, guess what? It's not so much the future. Their future is sort of taken care of. It's the past, it's traditions that are important. It's the decisions being made on the basis of history and decorum. Well, for persons living in multi-generational poverty, well, guess what's important? It's the present. It's that survival mode. Decisions are based on what they need to survive. Now, where we're going with all of this is how a person living in these classes approaches higher education. So begin to think about, persons, most of our students that come to our universities, our community colleges, may be middle class. So it's easy to motivate them with the future to work hard to get that degree that matches their thinking. But what about persons living in poverty, right? They're struggling for the present. So we'll talk about that more in just a moment. How about money? Well, for those of us in the middle class, we've got to manage it, right? We've got a budget, and we're watching that bank account as the end of the pay period gets close. We're managing our money. Well, persons in the wealth class, they're conserving their money, they're investing their money, hopefully, they're donating their money. But for persons living in generational poverty, money is something that's spent at the moment because it's needed. You don't have very much of it. So when you get it, you spend it kind of quickly. So you see there how the framework about money is different. Destiny. This one's really important. Later in the webinar, we're going to be talking about locus of control being one of the things that we measure with SmarterMeasure. But destiny for the middle class is that we believe in choice, that we can change the future by good choices now, right? So if we work hard, if we choose to work hard, if we apply ourselves, we'll be rewarded with that. Well, for persons in the wealth class, their destiny is to hopefully be responsible, to be generous, to use their wealth to build those connections, to establish and maintain that good name and that reputation that their family has. And then, of course, for persons in generational poverty, well, it's more of a belief in fate that really you can't do much because no matter what happens, it never works out bad. That's the way it's always been. You can't do much to mitigate chance. And then finally, and really where all of this is going, is how do persons in the different classes view education? Well, for us in the middle class, it's critical, right? Especially those working in higher ed, we're making the case that a degree really will help you climb that success ladder, right? That's the rationale that we give. Well, for persons living in wealth, education is good, but what's really good about it is making the connections. And so super wealthy people go to the Ivy League schools where it's all about who else is going there and what school can you say you went to, right? But regrettably, and the whole reason why we're having this conversation today is that for persons living in multi-generational poverty, education is, while it's valued, it's just an abstract, right? It's not something that's the reality for them because of the situation they live in. For years, one of our mottos here at SmarterServices has been that one of the best ways to break the cycle of poverty is through higher education. We firmly believe that. And that's why when I was exposed to this framework recently, I was like, oh, I've got to share that with our clients because this mental model really will help us as we have qualitative conversations with our students, regardless of which social class they live in. Now, what does this tiger have to do with all of this? Those of you who have been SmarterMeasure clients for a while probably have heard me say, you can't change a tiger's stripes, but you can teach a tiger to hunt in a different environment. And that's a very important concept in what we're talking about today. That the purpose of this conversation, the purpose of understanding this framework so that we can help students, is that we are not trying to change a student. We value that student, regardless of which one of those social economic strata they come in. We're not trying to change that student. We're trying to help that student understand how that a student like them can be successful in higher ed. So with a tiger, we're just holding a mirror up to that tiger so that that tiger can see its stripes. We're not trying to change the tiger's stripes. We're trying to teach it how to hunt in this jungle that is higher ed. By the way, while I've said that phrase for years, just today I used generative AI to generate this message. I said, create for me an image of a tiger hunting on a college campus. That's what it came up with. See the columns of the building back there? So that's kind of neat now that I have a visual image to visually illustrate that concept that we've talked about for years. So now with that framework in mind, remember all of that as we look at some of these great practices from Amarillo College. They got started doing this over a decade ago. They noticed in their community of Amarillo there was a growing trend of poverty, educational attainment was decreasing. So they got together and they created what they called the No Excuses Poverty Initiative. They did have a grant that kind of kickstarted it, but what they put together was an institutionally supported, systematic approach that's institution wide, which is very important. And out of that, they developed 4 primary programs: social services, a food pantry, a mentoring program, and a career center. Now, I could tell you more about what they do, and I will in just a moment, but seeing them explain it is where the real power is. So we're about to watch a video that they provided. It's 10 minutes long, and you may want to go grab a tissue. I've seen this video more than once, and when I watched it again this morning, I got to tell you, I teared up a little bit. And if you tear up a little bit, that's okay too. All that means is that you care about students. And I'm telling you, if you're here for this second session of the webinar, I know you care about students. So let's watch this video about how Amarillo College cares about their students as well.
It's a city formed in the wide open spaces of the Texas High Plains in the heart of the Northern Panhandle, Amarillo. And it's growing a reputation for opening its heart to students who often get left behind on the road to a higher education.
Our driving vision is that we will love the students we have, not the students we wished we had or thought we had. Embrace who's on your campus, and it really starts with listening to your students.
That's at the heart of the transformation happening at Amarillo College. It's the city's 2-year community college with 10,000 students. Dr. Russell Lowry Hart is its president.
For us, that reformation started by listening to our students and asking them what the perfect college was for them, and then building ourselves to be that college. Any institution in the country can do that.
Lowry Hart knew Amarillo College staff had to listen and change because the status quo wasn't working. The school data on college graduation and the transfer rates to 4-year colleges was grim.
And we were really shocked. We thought we were better than we were. But we functionally had a 13% completion and transfer rate combined. That's not worthy of our community. That's not worthy of our students. So that data point is what launched our movement to understand who our students were and how we could love them more effectively.
Lowry Hart started surveying students to see why so many couldn't complete their associate's degrees.
It wasn't academic issues, it was all life issues. The top 10 barriers our students identified were life issues: healthcare, food, housing, transportation, childcare, utility payments. Our students were telling us repeatedly that they were dropping out of school because their car broke down or they lost their childcare.
How can you expect your students that have kids to come to your class when they can't put their children in childcare?
A citywide study showed that less than a third of Amarillo residents had a post-secondary education.
The majority of our community is living in the war zone of poverty.
27 is the average age of students at Amarillo College. They are mostly women, often mothers, attending part-time, working at least 2 jobs, and barely making ends meet. The majority are first-generation students, and they want to be acknowledged.
They wanted us to see them. Our students were seeking relationships and service and support, and what we were offering was bureaucracy, acronyms, and paper. I knew that the college had to rebuild itself around the students we had.
They are students like Dolores McMurray, a mother of 4 and a grandmother, who was losing jobs and promotions because she didn't have a college degree.
For a minute, you think you're not good enough. But I know better. I know better. I so know better. Maybe not good enough for you, but I am good enough.
And motivated enough to return to college in her early 50s and major in business management while living with a disability and living on the edge financially. Amarillo College has created a culture of caring to help low-income students like Dolores far beyond financial aid. In 2012, college faculty launched a No Excuses Poverty Initiative.
What No Excuses functionally means is instead of inflicting a painful, pull yourself up by the bootstraps metaphor on our students, it means that we hold ourselves accountable with no excuses. So in higher education, if you remove excuses from the work that you're doing, then it doesn't matter if the high school prepared them. It doesn't matter if the students come to your report. Then you have to build systems to address that barrier. And that work has been incredible.
That work at Amarillo College includes more tutoring assistance for students, poverty training for all faculty, and an early alert system with engaged instructors tuned into students' needs.
And they can click their early alert and say, this student's got a transportation barrier or a childcare barrier, and that will automatically go to our social workers and they will intervene.
Social workers oversee a 2-year-old advocacy and resource center, the nucleus of the Poverty Initiative, where Dolores and many others receive help.
Hi, good to see you.
We provide traditional tuition and textbook scholarships along with childcare assistance and transportation assistance in the form of gas reimbursement.
The Advocacy and Resource Center, also called the ARC, has a food pantry, a clothing closet, and oversees an emergency fund from the Amarillo College Foundation. The fund helps students pay for things like car repairs, utility payments, and rental assistance. And staff connects students to community resources, too.
Hello, Miss Joe. How are you?
Although Dolores works at a bingo parlor and has even worked 2 jobs at times to pay bills, she says her college dreams would have ended without support from the ARC.
You have no idea how much I thank you guys. Many days I didn't know how I was going to make it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. The warmth and just home. Yeah. This is really like home. They help my spirit. They help my heart. They help just my whole mindset. They didn't make you feel this little. They made you feel this big. Even when I was low on food or with my rent, when I lost my job and didn't know how everything was, I had my rent paid.
Emergency funds have kept Edward Pena from dropping out of college. He works at a nursing home, but he's also working on an associate's degree in nursing at Amarillo College and plans to become a doctor. His father always told him,
you need to go to school. Education is the best. That's going to take you anywhere. You know, it's going to open doors.
Edward's fiancée, Laura, is in college with him, also getting a nursing degree. With college tuition for 2 and a baby girl, money is tight.
So they helped us with transportation money. They helped us with daycare money, which is quite a bit.
And through the No Excuses Poverty Initiative, Amarillo College paid a month of the couple's rent.
We're so fortunate to be in a college that really cares for you, that wants to see you succeed. They want to watch you succeed. So you're not just a number, you're a student that is going to succeed.
Our future of our country depends on our ability to educate every student in our community. We can't survive economically as a country with skill sets that are based in a high school diploma, as important as that step is. And the future of higher education rests on our ability to love the lowest income students, the most at-risk students, to success, and rebuilding ourselves so that they can actually lead our communities forward.
Time reveals a new story of student success at Amarillo College in light of the new poverty initiatives. Students' completion rates have tripled.
And I'm proud to say that in 2017, our completion rates were 45%.
And it's close to graduation time for Edward Pena, a day when he will make his father proud.
I'm very excited for him to be in the stands, waiting to hear my name be called.
Even my grandchildren want to do it.
Dolores' grandkids already want to follow in her footsteps. She's close to graduation day, too.
I will probably be bawling. I may bawl before then, I may bawl today. Just having that degree, knowing that you accomplished something this big, this is huge. This is amazing.
Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed seeing that video about what they're doing at Amarillo College. You know, when you saw President Lowry Hart there, and one of his comments was that persons living in poverty that don't have their basic needs met, one of the things that they really crave is just to be seen. Well, that phrase "to be seen" comes from an experience of his a few years ago when he actually did a social experiment. He went to another city. He went to Waco, Texas, where he adorned himself as a homeless person, lived on the streets of Waco for an entire weekend just to see what that was like. And one of the things he wrote in the story I read about it was that there was a Sunday morning. He was there on the street. A family, obviously clothed to go to worship, walked by, but they would not look at him. So he cried out, "Please look at me. I'm a university president," which of course they probably thought he'd lost his mind. But he really was a university president. And so he really cares about this and just as passionate about this and started this program. So lots of kudos to him and the work he started and the work they're continuing there at Amarillo College. Now, one of the things that was referenced in that video was that obviously while the college wants to provide a lot of advocacy and resources, there are many other resources that are available to students. So they're at that link that you'll see, and we'll send out this slide deck so you'll see this link. But I want to take you to a page that's on their website. Well, if I can get my little, let's see if I can move it down a little bit. There we go. I want you to see this page from the Advocacy and Resource Center. And for all these categories, there's a drop-down menu, and there's lots of different resources, childcare resources. They're available in their community, right? Affordable clothing resources. There they are. What are these resources doing? They're teaching that tiger how to hunt, right? They're equipping that tiger with the tools that it needs to hunt in this jungle of higher education and be successful. And that's something that your school, if it hasn't already, you can emulate this. You can do an environmental scan to see what are the different resources in our community that are available to our students, and let's make them easily accessible through a page on our website, right? Just take some effort to do that, but it will be so helpful to the student, because going back to the mindset, when a person lives in generational poverty and their historical mindset, right, is not one about thinking about the future, not one about looking for other resources, they're not equipped with this knowledge. So equipping those students with the knowledge of the resources available could be what it takes to make a lot of the difference. One of the things that President Larry Hart referenced in that video was their top 10 student needs. So I wanted to share that with you. This is what they found. And as you look at this list, think about at your institution. How closely parallel is this list to what your students experience? Obviously, there's financial need. Some of that your school may be able to help with, especially if you get grants. But helping the students go through that complicated federal financial aid process. As I said, I've got a daughter in college. I've got a PhD in higher education leadership. And guess what? It was complicated for me to fill out the FAFSA, right? So, how can someone that's a first generation college student that has no frame of reference, no awareness about how the federal financial aid policies, how all that works, how can they hunt in that jungle, right? So, helping those students navigate that and get the federal financial aid first that they qualify for, that goes such a long way. Other basic needs are shelter. I read about great things that are happening with the community colleges in California because they realize that many of their students live in their vehicles, right? So, what many of them have done is they've selected a parking lot on their campus. They've built a fence around that parking lot, not to keep people out, but to keep people in. So, what happens is students that are living in their vehicles come into the parking lot. They know that the gates are going to close and be locked at a certain time of night. I think it's like at 11 o'clock at night. And so the people parked, sleeping in their cars, can feel safe because they're in a gated, well lit parking lot. Those parking lots also are adjacent to a building where they have access to the restrooms. They set up a tent there where they've worked out programs with different pizza places in the community that they'll bring pizzas by there in the evening. So they're providing some food, they're providing a safe place to park their vehicle, they're providing restrooms. And so that's something that community colleges in California are doing for persons that don't have shelter. They're living in their vehicles, right? So many students need transportation assistance, childcare, utilities, the food pantry that you saw there on the video. So many needs, and probably your students have very similar needs as well. So here's some slides that they provided from Amarillo College. What are their top 6 interventions that they're doing for these students? First of all is the social services. You saw the name of the ARC, the ARC is the Advocacy and Resource Center. We know what resources are. Those are the tangible things you give out. But advocacy is what begins it, right? It's being an advocate for the student because they may not know how to hunt in this jungle of higher ed. You saw the food pantry. I love the name of what they call their mentoring program because their name conveys their heart, right? It's called the Coaches and Champions Mentoring Program. The coaches are the faculty, the advisors, the people who are talking to the students. And what do they call their students? That's their champions, right? These students want to be not only seen, they want to be valued. So in this program, they're presented as a champion, that if you overcome these barriers, you are a champion. So their mentoring program is called Coaches and Champions. I just love that. They've got the career and employment services there. The early alert system, I wanted to say something about that here on this next slide. There you see Kara Crowley. She actually was one of the leaders there. She too has recently left Amarillo College. She's now also up in Austin. I'll say something about Austin in just a moment. But most of your schools probably have an early alert system that, based on engagement data or based on early academic success data, flags students at being at risk of dropping out, right? So you've probably got those. And some of the things that you're looking at are some of the first bullets there of academic dishonesty or behavioral mental health concerns, disability services, low grades or low attendance. But look at that 5th bullet. That's something that is a part of the early alert system at Amarillo College that may not be a part of the early alert systems at many institutions. And those are the social services needs, right? But man, you think about that. When you look at the data, you know that so many students drop out of higher ed because their basic needs aren't being met. And if you're hungry and you don't have childcare and you don't have transportation, it's those life factors that are going to make you drop out. Well, we need to be raising the red flag for students that have those needs. And so that's why social services need is one of the data points that goes into their early alert system. So there's different ways that students can receive assistance. They could be referred through that early alert, or the advisors that are counseling the students, if they become aware of these needs, can refer them. Faculty members, as they're dealing with the students, other staff persons, as they're dealing with the students, or students can even self-refer themselves there to the ARC. Now, I'm just a guy that cares about people. I care about student success. I'm passionate about non-cognitive data, being able to help these students. I am not an expert in assisting students with their basic needs. I'm just trying to increase awareness. But you know what? There are people who are experts in this, and they're all going to be getting together in Austin later in April. And so I want you to know about this. President Lowry Hart is associated with this. CARA is associated with this. It's going to be April the 24th and 25th. It's called the Trellis Basic Needs Summit. They're going to be getting together for 2 days and talking about this very issue of what can we do. So I've been really impressed with the emails that I've gotten from several of you after this first webinar saying, wow, this topic really is of relevance and importance, and we're passionate about it. Some have even said these are steps that my school is going to take. Well, if your school can consider maybe sending somebody to this event in Austin in April, that would be tremendous, right? You'd learn so much. So just want to make you aware of that. Of course, that link there will be available in this slide deck as we send it out afterwards. So let me catch a breath and let me launch a poll here. Let's see if I can get back to my controls and poll and launch. Okay, so what this poll is doing is I would kind of like to hear from you. So we just looked at the list of the different interventions that Amarillo College is doing. And so on this poll, you can choose more than one, choose all of those that apply, but the degree to which you're aware of it right now. What are the interventions that your school is currently using, right? And this is not scientific. It doesn't matter if you're not aware of all of them. But what do? Do you provide a centralized office or a center for assisting students with basic needs? That's been a huge part of the success of Amarillo College. And you saw the center there on that video. You saw the people walk into that center and they were hugging the staff there. And they really are the advocates for the students. Now, they did get a grant that helped start that center. Maybe there's grant programs you can apply to. There may be industries in your local community that really are suffering because they don't have enough entry-level workers. Well, if you go to those industries and say, look, we're going to help people get this associate degree, or we're going to help them get this bachelor's degree so they can be better employees for you. So could your organization help us start a center? Maybe that would be an idea. Training advisors and faculty, stocking a food pantry. That's becoming more common. My daughter that is in college in a sorority, that's one of the social projects that her sorority does is they raise money and they also donate clothes. One thing I've learned about sorority sisters is they have a lot of clothes. And so they can donate some of those clothes to the clothing closet, have a food pantry they raise money for, just increasing awareness of the institution and community sponsored services. That's that website that we talked about, assistance with financial aid. I love this idea about distributing unused meal plan dollars to students with basic needs, or allowing students to donate some of their meal plan funds, right? That money's already been paid. Don't let it go to waste. Don't use it as profit for a university that's likely a not-for-profit institution. Divert that funds to people that really need it. And then the last bullet there is does your institution currently have conversations with learners that are struggling with their basic needs about how their mindset and their individual attributes may be impacting their college experience? Okay, so we've had lots of people vote. I'm going to end this poll, and I hope that you see it. I'm going to take a look at it here before we end it. Looks like providing assistance with financial aid is a leader. Stocking of food pantries a close second. The distributing unused meal plans is probably the least used. So let me end the poll and share the results. And I think you guys are seeing this now. And
Yes, I
we'll
can
share.
confirm we are.
Okay, great. And we will share the results of that unscientific quick poll as we follow up with our resources. But I think it's kind of interesting to see what your schools are doing and what you're not doing. Those are good practices. So I'll stop that now, and then we'll move on. Okay, so how can SmarterMeasure be used to inform and enrich the conversations that schools are having with students, that maybe these students have been identified through that early alert process, or maybe they've been referred by an advisor? How can you use SmarterMeasure data? Well, most of you are our clients, and you know what SmarterMeasure is. Some of you are not, so let me briefly explain. SmarterMeasure is an assessment that students take. Sometimes it's put in the admissions process. Very often it's in an orientation course. Sometimes it's in a first year experience plan. Sometimes it's put in an early academic course like English 101. Schools put it lots of different places. But what it's measuring are non-cognitive attributes about the student. That's their levels of motivation, their control over procrastination, willingness to ask for help, locus of control, time management, availability of computing resources, skills with using computer sources, skills with reading on screen, all of those things. That's not how smart they are, it's who they are and what's going on in their life, right? So SmarterMeasure is measuring those things about the student. SmarterMeasure is not identifying students living in generational poverty, but what it's doing is you can use the data from it to inform and to enrich conversations that your advisors, your first year experience people, your faculty members are having. So here's a screen that we kind of breezed past because we were running out of time in the first session, but I want to take a little bit deeper dive here. What's there on the left are the SmarterMeasure variables. So for your schools that are using SmarterMeasure, you've got this data for each student. You've got a quantitative metric of their degree of this variable, right? And if they are low on this variable, boy, you really need to have a conversation with them about it. And I put my little AI generated picture of my tiger there again, because remember that, right? You cannot change a tiger's stripes, but you can teach a tiger to hunt in a different environment. We are not trying to change students who are living in generational poverty. We're not trying to change their mindset. We're not trying to change their stripes, because you know what? When they're on your college campus, even if you've got something as wonderful as the ARC that they do at Amarillo College, they're going to walk out of that resource center and they're going to go back home, and they're going to be in that environment. They're going to be influenced by that mindset. You don't have the power as an institution to change that. So we're not trying to change the student. We're trying to hold up a mirror to the student and say, okay, how can a student like you, how can a person who's lived in generational poverty, who at no fault of your own has developed patterns of thinking that are often friction points with the patterns of thinking that higher ed is based on, because the rules of higher ed come from the norms of middle class, right? What are the things we value in higher ed? Oh, we love deadlines, don't we? We put deadlines on everything. We put in our syllabus what you got to do week 1 and week 2 and week 3. We love time management. We love all of these things we're about to look at. That's the way higher ed is built. Am I saying we need to change higher ed? No. Am I saying we need to change the student? No. We need to teach the student how to hunt in this jungle of higher ed using these metrics, using this data that we've got about the student. So what does that look like? Well, how about control over procrastination? Persons living in generational poverty very often are prone to procrastinate. Why? Because their mindset is survival. They're worried about today. So something that could be put off till tomorrow very likely will be put off till tomorrow. That's their mindset. We're not saying they're a bad person. We're saying the culture, the norms that they've been raised in kind of promote procrastination. So when they come to us as a student, what are we going to talk to them about in that conversation? Well, We can just talk about this phenomenon, about procrastination and how it may be natural for them, and kind of help them to see that there is a timeline used in the higher education courses, right? There are some things going to be done at certain times. Talk about what's going on in their life between now and the next deadline they've got on a course assignment. Have a practical conversation about, okay, when am I going to find time? When am I going to start on this specific assignment? You may be teaching them a skill that they've never used before, and it may be a game changer. How about this one? Availability of an appropriate place to study. Very likely that persons living in generational poverty are living in a household, if they have a house, that has multiple people living in it, likely does not have high speed internet, may not have computing devices in it. It's not a great environment to learn, right? So, what can you offer them? Well, probably, and most college campuses I've ever been to and worked on have got spaces that are designed for students to study. These may be carrels in the library, there may be other areas on your campus that set up as study areas. These students may not be aware of those. They may not have thought about the fact that I can go to this place and study, that I don't have to study at home. Could be a game changer. Willingness to ask for help. Persons living in generational poverty likely have had bad experiences in the past with authority figures not wanting to help them, but wanting to, not help them. What you've got to convey, and what Amarillo College has done a great job of conveying through their ARC, is that we're here and we care about you. We are going to be your advocate. So when you need help, if you may not be comfortable going directly to your faculty member, come to us. Let us go to that faculty member with you. Let us talk to you about how you can talk to that faculty member. Whatever the path forward is, let someone at your institution be that advocate, the person that the student is not afraid to reach out to help to. Another data point we collect is about technical competency and technical knowledge. Very good chance that someone living in poverty may not have a computing device appropriate for doing coursework with them. Now, they probably have a phone, one of these, and there are lots of things we can do with our learning management system on a phone, right? But there are some things we can't do, right? It's not great to compose a paper. You can't take a test. At some point, you got to have a computing device. Well, I know your school's got computing labs, and just making these students aware of those resources could be a game changer. Availability of time to study. Remember that mindset, that framework rather, when we were talking about time and how it's viewed differently across the socioeconomic strata, time management. When you are living in generational poverty and it's day to day, what am I going to eat? Day to day, how am I going to get transportation? Day to day, I need some shelter, right? That's where your mind is. And so planning about when you're going to study, that's not at the top of the list. So what conversations can your academic advisors, your social advocates have with the student when they've got a measurement of that student's availability of time? Well, maybe just sitting down with a calendar and going through an exercise of, okay, here's my week. I know you're working 2 jobs. We're not trying to change that. We're accepting that. We love you, even though you work 2 jobs and go to school. But with those 2 jobs, where can we find some time and plan that on a calendar? That may be the first time that they've done an exercise like that. Those of us in middle class, that's second nature to us, right? But to persons living in poverty, it's not second nature. And that's the main thing we're communicating through this webinar, is that persons living in generational poverty don't naturally think and act in ways that are congruent with the norms that we have in higher ed. Doesn't mean they're a bad person. Doesn't mean they can't be successful. It just means they need to have some coaching, right? They need to see that they too can be a champion after talking to their coach. How about reason for continuing your education? We saw that on the framework, right? Those of us in middle class, we know the reason. We've got the motivation. We've seen people go to college. We've seen people get great jobs after going to college, right? The persons living in poverty, they've never seen it modeled. You see this, the next one here, support from family and friends. I loved that lady who in that video that went back to school in her 50s, and she was about to graduate. And did you hear what she said? She said, now my grandchildren want to do it too. Think about that. The first person in her family to go to college. And what's it doing? It's influencing others. When you've grown up in generational poverty and nobody in your family has ever gone to college, or they've never been successful going to college because they weren't appropriately supported, it doesn't seem like the thing you ought to do, right? But if you can help one person in a family be successful and they see how it changes it, you literally could be taking that whole family out of the cycle of generational poverty. That's what we're here for. That's what educators want to do, right? Perception of academic skills. It may be that they've never really had good success academically. So be their advocate. Help them get that first passing grade. Man, if they make a C, let's have a party, right? Maybe if you've got a success center like Amarillo College had at the end of semester when grades come out, have a pizza party, and everybody that passed their class, they get to come have some pizza. Celebrate academic success, because there's a chance they've never had it celebrated. And there's a chance when they go back to their home and the norms of their home that it's not going to be valued. Nobody may be patting them on the back when they get home. So we need to be the one that supports students. Time management, we've obviously already talked about that one. Persistence, sticking to it. And remember, with SmarterMeasure, you've got a quantitative metric of all of these things that tells you, that identifies the students that are low in these areas. And the last, on-screen reading, we get that, but the last one there is what I think is at the heart of this whole issue, and that's locus of control. That's kind of a psychological construct. You may or may not be familiar with it. What it means is that I have very high or internal locus of control. I feel like if I want to set my mind to do something, I can do it and it'll work. But a person with low or external locus of control feels like no matter how hard they try, the system is against them. And you know why they feel that way? Because that's the pattern they've observed for generations in their family. So persons coming from generational poverty very likely may have a very low locus of control number. And like I said, SmarterMeasure doesn't identify persons living in generational poverty, but this one variable, if you look at your people who are scoring low on locus of control and correlate that to those of lower socioeconomic status, I think you're going to find a very high correlation there. So that's how you can use SmarterMeasure data that you've got the scores on to enrich the conversations that your academic advisors, your success coaches, your faculty members, your admissions people, whomever is front facing with a student can use this data to have those meaningful, game-changing conversations, which doesn't strive to change the tiger stripes, but it's teaching the tiger how to hunt in this environment. Let me say, as I was putting this together, I was very sad that Amarillo College did not have a person available to help, but it was difficult to find schools that are examples of excellent practice in this. We'd love to continue the conversations. So I need resource people. I need examples of this. So if your school is excelling at this, even in just one area, Amarillo College, boy, they're knocking it out of the park. Maybe your school isn't at their level, but maybe there's something you've done a good job of. Maybe you're stacking a food pantry. That's awesome. Maybe you've got a clothing closet. Maybe you're doing whatever, and you'd love to share with your colleagues how you did that. Reach out to me. My email is right here on the screen, Mac@SmarterServices, and say, hey, I'll be glad to share that. If I get some people that say I will share, we're going to have another one of these webinars the third Wednesday of next month. But if I don't hear from anybody, we're not going to have one. But you all can go to that meeting there in Austin in April and learn more about it. So we've got about 6 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to pause here and let my colleagues who've been monitoring that see, are there any questions that we need to talk about?
Hey, Mac, I've got, we did have a comment earlier. I think everybody could see that, but essentially the president is no longer at Amarillo College, the person you referenced, now at Austin State Community College. So that was just several months ago, last summer. Just wanted to make that call out. So thank you for the person who brought that up, but also had an inquiry or question about grants, any resources that we know of, or how schools would go about writing grants, where they might research where to find those. I know that that's what Amarillo College originally started. So just that was one of the questions.
Yeah, super question because it takes funding to do this, right? And so if some of your schools are aware of grants, that's why I mentioned one of the things I did when I was working at a university as a part of the Chancellor's Fellowship, and I spent a semester going out talking to employers in our area. And I said, okay, what do you need from our employees? And how can you help us? And so, even if there's not federal grants, think about local partnerships with industry as a way to raise some funding because who's going to benefit from your graduates? It's your local employers, right? So try to bridge that gap is one way. If some of you know some federal grants, email me that. I'll include that in this, our emails that we're sending out following up, or we can talk about it in the next webinar. Certainly, I would think if you go to that meeting in Austin in April, that they'll be talking about that because they are the experts. I'm not an expert. I'm just somebody that cares about students. Yeah, I was aware that President Lowry Hart is now up there in Austin, and Kara, that you saw her picture, also is there in Austin now. And guess where they're having this event? In Austin. So Austin is becoming the source of truth about this. So glad that they're doing more than keeping it weird in Austin. They're keeping it helpful.
That's funny. And we had another question, Mac, in particular about SmarterMeasure. The question, we had two different comments or questions, but essentially it's centered around when that would be delivered to students and how that would happen, like what we've done, and some generalizing, but that's the gist of what both of those questions were asking.
Yeah, so we don't dictate where a school administers the assessment. There's lots of great places where they put it in the student experience. Most often it happens very, very early in the student experience. One of the things that's beautiful about the SmarterMeasure data is that these non-cognitive factors, and we've done research we've been doing this now for 22 years, right? We've got data from over 7 million students. I'm confident this data is meaningful. I'm confident this data is predictive of students who are very likely to drop out early in their experience. Because when the deck is stacked against you, when you don't have that control over procrastination, you're not motivated, and you don't have the technical skills, that's when the straw breaks the camel's back and you drop out. So schools position this very early, so often in admissions, sometimes in a first year experience program, sometimes in a new student orientation course, or sometimes in a very early academic course, because this data can be collected and you can identify at-risk students before you ever give them a chance to fail. Now, the early alert systems that we talked about are great, and I hope your school is using them. If you've got an LMS like Blackboard or Canvas and the student's not logging in, or the student's not engaging, or they're failing their first test, that early engagement and success data is critical. But guess what? You've allowed the student to fail before you've identified them. Using SmarterMeasure data early on, maybe even before they take their first class, you can identify high-risk students and be an advocate for them before they ever start their first class. So in answer to your question, you can place it wherever you want to. I suggest placing it very early in the admissions process, not as a gatekeeper to say you can't come in, but as a tool to say, hey, help us help you. We want to get to know you because you're becoming our student, and we're going to use this data to help you. Got
Thanks,
about a
Mac.
minute.
I don't see anything else, but I did want to add one thing to what you said. Carol and I, we would love to, for those of you who are interested, to learn a little bit more. On occasion, we do provide trial logins and let people take the assessment and try it out. So again, if that's something you're interested in or want to share with us your QEP, your initiatives, we would love if what we have is not a good fit, we have a lot of other good resources or people that we know that we can connect you with, and we would love to do that because, as Max stated, we are all extremely passionate about this, and we've all been really well educated about this in the past year. And so that was some things that we didn't always necessarily know. So we're learning right along with you guys.
Okay, so for the record, we are ending this webinar exactly at the top of the hour. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.